When I was a little kid, we used to all pile in the car after church and we'd go for a ride, and invariably we'd have to stop and get some gas. And when we did, we would pull up to a gas station and someone, believe this or not, would come out and put gas in our car for us. They were called an attendant. The attendant would come up and ask my dad, "What can I do for you, sir?" And he'd say, "Fill her up," sometimes. You know, and I think that's generally the way we feel about Thanksgiving. When we get those big piles and mounds of food, the turkey and the cranberries and the mashed potatoes and all the fixings, and of course, don't forget the stuffing. Now, I was thinking about this. You know, for a lot of people, that seems to be the main attraction for Christmas, stuffing. I mean, of Thanksgiving, I should say. Stuffing. And that is to say that we like to stuff ourselves and we like to fill ourselves up with football games and family and friends and whatnot, and buy a couple, have a couple, but I don't think that's exactly what they had in mind when they came up with this idea of Thanksgiving. They had something else planned. Originally, it was all about thanking God for the blessings that we have each and every year. It's just food for thought. I just want you to think about that. Speaking of food, there's an article I read about this California scientist that tells me that most Americans, men and women, will eat 16 times their body weight each year. I'll probably do that on Thanksgiving alone, but most people take a whole year to do that. And I guess the lesson from, or the contrary part of that, is that horses only do 8 times their weight, which proves you should, if you want to lose weight, you should eat like a horse, right? Is that what that would prove? You better turn up the lights. Those jokes will be better when it's brighter up here. Yeah, see? See how much better that is? Now, God has high expectations for us, especially around this time of the year, about being thankful, and we don't always do our best with that. I remember a time that I bought a present for my brother for Christmas. And I went out and spent a lot of time looking for this present. I made sure I got just the right one, because I bought him something that I actually wanted, which is, you know, kind of typical for youngsters to do. I bought him exactly what I wanted. I think that's sometimes how we look at Thanksgiving. We do for ourselves when we forget to do for God. And it's a good thing that we start off on a meal with prayer, and I hope that's a minimum everybody does at Thanksgiving. Give thanks to God with at least through a prayer. But Jesus tells us that we need to take it a step further, that we also need to give our thanks through our deliberate acts of servanthood, of being a servant. I suppose everybody knows the story how Thanksgiving started, right? Back in 1621, the Pilgrims showed up on the beaches of New England in a place called Plymouth, and they had a very difficult start there. They were trying to escape from religious persecution, and they ended up on the beaches here and suffered a very difficult first winter. The truth is that they lost half of the people that were there in the colony that very first year. And part of the problem was, and maybe a big part of the problem is, they didn't have the knowledge. They really didn't know how they were going to survive. Nobody taught them anything. And the other part of the problem was Publix was years away from establishing a store there, so they really struggled at the beginning. Now, there was a solution, though, in the form of a Native American Indian by the name of Squanto. And you might have heard that he had a very adventurous life, actually. Fascinating life, in fact. He was actually captured by the English and brought over to Spain and sold as a slave. But to his good fortune, the people that purchased him happened to be friars, religious guys. And they had bought him with the idea that they would free him. Along with his freedom that he gained, they also gave him an education in Christianity. And so he kind of fumbled around Europe for a couple of years, and he actually ended up back in his hometown a few years later, back in this little village that was right next to where the Pilgrims had landed. And it was just the perfect time to be there, exactly when they needed him the most. Because Squanto was the person that came and gave them the information they needed to survive the next year. Not only just survive, he gave them the information so they could flourish. The timing was impeccable. It saved the Pilgrims, his being a servant. The governor the governor of Plymouth, William Bradford, said this about Squanto. He was a special instrument sent of God for their good. See, God uses us that way. He'll find us in whatever form we are. Because I got to tell you, Squanto was not a perfect person. The more you dig into the history of Squanto, you'd realize that this guy actually had some flaws. He was not perfect. In fact, he ended up not being liked by anybody in the end, but God used him as a perfect servant at the right time. And that's something he can use each and every one of us in the same way. George Washington, our first president, is the one that started a national holiday for Thanksgiving. But interestingly enough, many of the presidents after him didn't follow suit with that. It wasn't until 1830 that Abraham Lincoln created a permanent holiday that we know today as Thanksgiving on a Thursday. And what inspired him to do that was a woman named Sarah Hale. Now, Sarah had spent 17 years writing letters to other presidents, trying to get them to do the same thing. And the reason she succeeded with Abraham Lincoln is she implored him to use this day to find some balance, to find some way to reunify this country that was being torn apart by a civil war. So Abraham Lincoln in 1830 made it a permanent holiday for us. Now, Sarah Hale, she's an interesting woman. I mean, fascinating woman. I bet you didn't know that she is the one that wrote Mary Had a Little Lamb. I bet you didn't know that. No, I bet you didn't. But that's just a small tip of the iceberg of what she had done with her life. You see, in that poem, Mary Had a Little Lamb, the reason she wrote that particular poem is because 150 years ago, she was just alarmed at the kind of lyrics in the songs that they had. Can you imagine that? So she was inspired to write this poem in response to that. And she put in a special message in that poem. And I'm going to read you just the last stanzas of that poem to see if you can hear that message. What makes the lamb love Mary so? The eager children cry. Oh, Mary loves the lamb, you know, the teacher did reply. And you each gentle animal in confidence may bind and make them follow at your call if you are always kind. Now, some people have suggested that Mary was the Virgin Mary and the lamb was Jesus, and I don't think the message is that complex, actually. That last line tells us what she meant by that poem, and it's very simple. We need to lead by example to be kind. That's all it said, and Jesus tells us the same thing. He not only told us, but he showed us. He lived the lifestyle of having love in your heart and a servant's attitude. And I love in the scripture that he used this morning, he said, whoever wants to be first, be last of all, and servant of all. Yes, Sarah Hale was an extraordinary woman. She actually helped found Vassar University. She was inspirational in raising funds for some of the biggest national monuments we have in the country. She raised an extraordinary amount of money for that. There's a literary prize named after her. Just to name but a few of the things. She was a servant of her community. She was a servant of her country. And most importantly, she was a servant for God. Yes, our servanthood starts with prayer, giving thanks to God. But listen to this. If all you do is mouth the words thanks to God, which is important, trust me, it's important, but you never follow it up with any actions, I would think that after a while that those words lose their power because you didn't live them out by being the servant that Christ asks us all to be. You see, our central purpose as Christians, is to be servants. And as soon as you figure that out, as soon as you understand what it is God is calling us all to do, the better your life is, the more fulfilled it is, the easier it is for you to find direction and know what you're going to do with your life. And that's that point you start to sense Christ in your lives. That's what Jesus asks us to do. Be a servant. And I got to tell you, I struggle sometimes with my commitment not to go to fast food restaurants. I've said it more than once, I'm really working on not going there, but yesterday I kind of broke down, and actually it was 2 days in a row I broke down and went to Wendy's. First it was my fault, and the second was the kids' fault. They forced me to go the second time. I couldn't hardly stop myself. The founder of Wendy's, though, was a great servant, actually. Name of Dave Thomas. Now, Dave grew up in an orphanage and was finally adopted by a family, but he never finished high school. And he wrote a book entitled, how did he write that book? Well Done, The Common Guy's Guide to Everyday Success. And Dave said in this book that he actually got an MBA. He got an MBA before he got his GED. And see, Dave was a regular guy. I mean, he really was. And he prided himself in leading by example. In fact, they had a photo of him in their annual report with him in a yellow bucket and a mop. And he would claim he's the only CEO in a big company that ever took a picture like that. You see, in Wendy's world, MBA didn't stand for Masters of Business Administration. It stood for something else. Mop bucket attitude. That's what it stood for. And that's what Christ calls us to have, is a mop bucket attitude. You see, Christ calls on us to not be the ones who are served, but to be the servants. And you know what it is? When you find real happiness in life, your jobs in life turn into vocations and callings and opportunities as opposed to jobs. When people really find their calling in life, that's when they can start to find happiness. When we have a mop bucket attitude, it's amazing how we can clean up.